Dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 7th of October of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first, we're going to talk about another massive drone attack that took place during the previous night. And pro-Ukraine resources this morning published this photo. Obviously, this attack wasn't the biggest attack against Ukrainians and on Ukrainians' facilities and energy infrastructures, but this attack was also very painful for Ukraine. The sources are saying that the Russians were attacking and trying to destroy the energy facilities on the territory of the city of Poltava. The sources are saying that currently Poltava is experiencing power outages. Power or part of the city is without electricity. Furthermore, the Russians, according to this map and according to different sources, attacked the city of Kharkiv. According to information we have, this time the Russians were trying to destroy not just energy facilities, but the Russians were trying to hit and to damage and to destroy warehouses and ammo depots. I would like to remind you that Ukraine attacked the city of Belgorod from the city limits of the city of Kharkiv using HIMARS launching missile systems. So this is the reason why the Russians are so focused and over-concentrated on the town. Furthermore, the sources are saying that Kharkiv faces its hardest winter since the war, says local, governor. After the destruction of two transformer substations, the coming winter will be especially difficult for Kharkiv. At any moment, another attack on critical infrastructure could occur, which could destroy in seconds what we spent months building and rebuilding. So this is the statement made by him. Furthermore, Zelensky also made lots of statements regarding the energy of Ukraine. He stated that Russia is attempting to destroy Ukraine's gas production and predicts an increase in attacks on this infrastructure. It will be very difficult to protect all of this, but we are building reserves so that people have gas and electricity. We will fight and increase our own production step by step. Once again, according to many sources, according to many experts, this winter is going to be the most difficult winter for Ukraine, and the Russians are trying to do just one thing: to create such a situation when Zelensky and Ukraine itself would be forced to accept Russia's demands and to capitulate. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground, and first let's talk about the Zaporozhye direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. According to information we have, during the previous 12 hours, the Russians improved their positions once again. I would like to remind you that several days ago, the Russians began their Poltavka offensive operation. So this is a small offensive operation, tactical offensive, in the direction of the first and the most southern fortified area by the name of Poltavka fortified area. And as a result of clashes during the previous several days, the Russians first of all managed to answer the settlement itself. More precisely, they answered the western part and the central part of the village. They cut the village basically in two parts. Now the Russians are trying to clear the southern part, and the Russians, according to information we have, managed to improve their positions in the northern and the northeastern parts of the settlement. Today, pro-Ukraine resources reported that the Russians also managed to maintain the line between two front lines, between the Poltavka fortified area and the Uspenovka fortified area. So the Russians now most likely will try to continue offensive operation further in the western direction with the purpose to cut the monolith defense of the Uspenka Poltavka fortified territory. Now let's move further. According to pro-Ukraine resources, the Russians also managed to enter the settlement of Novogrigorovka. So we believe that in coming days, the Russians will intensify their offensive operation with the purpose to establish complete control over the territory. But the most important update for the previous 24 hours we got from the settlement by the name of Alexeyevka. So this map was provided today by pro-Ukraine resources, and according to this map, as you can see, the Russians managed to break through Ukrainian defense and to enter the southern part of the settlement of Alexeyevka. Most likely the Russians captured territories of these farms in the southern part, so these barracks were captured by Russia. Before this attack, we got this video. This video was published by pro-Russian resources, and here we can see how Russians, right before this offensive operation, attacked the settlement of Alexeyevka with multiple launch rocket systems. So this was an artillery preparation before the beginning of battle. So once again, the Russians moved further and currently the clashes are taking place for this village, very important village in the entire Zaporozhye direction. And if Russians, as a result of offensive, are able to establish complete control over the territory and to force Ukrainians to fall back further in the northern direction, this could be a very important achievement of the Russians, because as you can see, to the north of the settlement of Alexeyevka, we can see the river of Volcha. So this is the river, very big river that cuts this territory basically in two parts, and there are not so many bridges and not so many different places where Ukrainians can cross the river of Volcha with the purpose to bring forces to the south to the river, with the purpose to organize an offensive operation or counter-offensive attacks. And if Russians establish control of Alexeyevka, most likely Russians will be able to establish complete control over the main supply lines and possible places where Ukrainians can cross the river. And from this very moment, the Ukrainians will lose any possibilities to bring and introduce additional forces in this front line. They would be forced to do this a bit further from the northwestern direction, from the settlement of Pokrovsk. But there are not so many roads that Ukrainians can use for these purposes, and all these roads would be also under complete Russian control when talking about FPV drones. So the situation remains tense for Ukrainians in this area. There are battles for Uspenovka and Poltavka territories have begun, and now Russians are trying to move further in the direction of Velika Mikhailovka and Pokrovsk. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of the city of Pokrovsk. Currently, there are very heavy clashes for this territory. I would like to remind you that several days ago, more precisely on the 2nd of October of 2025, the Russians launched their major offensive operation in this area with the purpose to establish complete control over the southern part of the city of Pokrovsk. And I would like to remind you that if Russians are able to take the southern part of the city of Pokrovsk and the complete control, most likely this is going to be the beginning of complete collapse of the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration's defense and of the entire Donbas defense operation that is currently carried out by Ukrainians. So what is happening today? The Russians began their major offensive on the 2nd of October, and every single day from that date, we were adjusting the map just in Russian favor. So this is the situation on the 3rd of October. This is the situation on the 4th of October. The Russians improved their positions in the southern part. This is the situation by the end of the 5th of October. The Russians have almost finished the battle for the citadel of the city of Pokrovsk, and the Russians almost secured the western part of the city. This is the situation by the end of the 6th, and now this is the situation by the beginning of the 7th of October of 2025. And as you can see, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish almost complete control over the western part of the city of Pokrovsk. The Russians captured the southern part of railways between the villages of Kotlina and the city of Pokrovsk. The Russians managed to improve their positions along the railways in the central part of the city as well. And the most important is that the Russians somehow managed to cross the railways and to begin offensive operation in the direction of the industrial zone, the most important part of the city and the Pokrovsk agglomeration itself. So the Russians crossed the railways at 3 places in the southwestern, in the southern and the southeastern parts. By these 3 attacks, the Russians are trying to block the road M30. The Russians are trying to answer the heart of this industrial zone, and the Russians are trying to block logistic along the Ivana Mazepy street that goes from the northern part of the city of Pokrovsk in the eastern direction, in the eastern part of the industrial zone. As we discussed in the previous videos, if Russians are able to establish complete control over this important, the most important area of the city of Pokrovsk, most likely after this very moment we'll be able to start counting days before the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration will fall in Russians' hand. So this is the situation. This is a very critical situation for the armed forces of Ukraine, and the most decisive and the most vital battle for the Pokrovsk agglomeration has begun. At the same time, the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack Russians in the area of breakthrough. The Ukrainians sent several tanks in the area of the settlement of Zolotoy Kolodets with the purpose to counterattack Russians and to restore control over the true line in this area, but Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian tank and to destroy it with FPV drones. Furthermore, the Russians managed to restore almost complete control over the settlement by the name of Pankovka. And this is a very important video published by pro-Russian resources. I would like to point your attention mentioned that in this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians with FPV drones, and how Ukrainians were attacking Russian tanks, armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles. Telling the truth, we haven't seen these attacks like this with vehicles and tanks for a very long period of time. And now we see that the Russians began using these tactics once again. And the most important is that the Russians are being attacked by Ukrainians not somewhere behind the city of Selidova, somewhere in the area of the mainland. The Russians were attacked by Ukrainian drones basically along the line of combat contact, which means that the Russians managed to bring their vehicles, their tanks, to the line of combat contact. And now the Russians are trying to finish the battle completely for the Shakhovo pocket by sending more and more armored vehicles and tanks. Ukrainians, most likely, if the Russians continue these attacks, most likely they will lose control over the Shakhovo pocket in coming days, and this is going to be another step to the complete defeat of the armored forces of Ukraine in this direction. Now let's talk about the city of Konstantinovka. During the previous 12 hours, additional changes on the ground were recorded and published by pro-Russian sources. The Russians are saying that they managed to break through Ukraine defense along N20 road, and now the Russians began advancing further in the southeastern direction towards the settlement of Berezok. This information was provided by pro-Russian sources. Furthermore, the Russians stated that the settlement of Kliban-Byk was also captured by Russia. So this is the situation by the end of the 6th of October, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 7th of October. Now the Russians are trying to finish the battle completely for the Kliban-Bytskaya water reservoir and to maintain the lines between the villages of Nilipovka and Yablunovka and Rusin Yar. So everything along this red line is what the Russians are tasked for. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Liman direction. The sources are saying that the Russians also managed to improve their positions significantly in the area of the settlement of Novoselovka. This is the situation by the end of the 6th of October, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 7th of October. As you can see, the Russians caught the Ukrainians on the territory of Novoselovka in pincers. Now the Russians will tighten the news until the Ukrainians are being forced to fall back from this area towards the settlement of Yarova. After the Russians finish the battle for Novoselovka, they will be able to consolidate additional troops with the purpose to begin offensive operation, and this time in the direction of the settlement by the name of Drobusheva. So we believe that in coming days a major offensive operation in this area will also begin. Furthermore, the Russians also advanced in the direction of the settlement of Stavki from two directions, from the north and from the settlement of Zarichna that was recently captured by the armored forces of the Russian Federation as well. So as we can see, the situation for Ukraine is very difficult. The Russians attack Ukrainian energy facilities, transport facilities. The Russians attack city along the line of combat contact with drones, and the Russians advance along the entire line of combat contact starting from the Zaporozhye direction and ending with the Kupiansk direction. It seems that the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine is crumbling, and it's very difficult to understand what exactly Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, is going to do with this. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.